Good afternoon, everyone. This will be the first lecture in the strategy course, and we'll deal with identifying what we mean when we talk about strategy. The course objectives are to understand the concept of strategy, to understand the logic of strategic advantage at a business level and at a corporate level, and to acquire some skills of strategy diagnosis, analysis and strategy formulation with, where appropriate, case analysis and discussion and the use of analytical tools. The presentation that will follow describes corporate and competitive strategy, secondly some strategic tools, thirdly strategic thinking by means of game theory, and ultimately some thoughts on competitive advantage. The history of strategy is not a very long one. It goes back to the 1950s. Of course, this only applies to business studies. Strategy as an idea goes back to Sun Tzu, and maybe even further, though we don't have records, which is 500 BC, with the art of war. In fact, strategy has been used through most of the centuries between that time and this, applied to military situations. Now, in many ways, a military situation is very like a corporate situation, except that there is not literally blood on the carpet, but there is the same competitive element and the same need to have a strategy if one is to win. So, prior to the 1950s, the idea of strategy was contained in what was called business policy. Largely this involved in business schools, early retired, or not necessarily early, corporate executives of a fairly senior level, describing things that had happened to them in their companies, and the students were then expected to draw some conclusions. Only after the 1950s did the idea of strategy as an academic discipline start to develop, and it was fully 1980 with the advent of Michael Porter and his analytical tools that it became a fixture in the core courses for a business study. If we look at this diagram, this was put together by Professor Porter and shows how the idea of corporate strategy and in the public sector of program planning led on to the development of long-range planning systems in the early 60s. Unfortunately, these didn't work because nobody really knows what the future will be, and a long-range planning system is therefore unlikely to end up with the results that one hopes for. Disillusion with that led to portfolio planning. The most common analytical tool of that is the Boston box, and there was a period during the early 50s when all the major consulting companies were using portfolio planning to help multi-business corporations to see where they were and identify where they were going. Unfortunately, if everybody did the same thing, the results were not terribly insightful, though it was seen that portfolio planning was quite a useful thing to do for consultants and for their clients. After that, there was a breakout of strategy into single-word solutions, corporate culture, incremental strategy development, intrapreneurship, and implementation were four such words that were used in the business literature to identify what one really meant by a strategy. And this led on to strategic management, which I have identified with the advent of Professor Porter. There were, of course, other colleagues of his in Harvard and elsewhere that contributed, but he was perhaps the academic that had the most influence in pulling together the basic model of strategic development, which attempts to take economics and make it more practical. The idea of strategic management was to analyze consumer needs, to identify the business idea, to see how you could gain competitive advantage, to identify the behavior of competitions, and within all this understand the logic of the industry, all of which led to what was called strategic thinking. From there, when we moved into the 60s, it's perhaps the case that things moved a little more slowly, but various other developments came about, namely the resource-based view, cooperative strategies, an evolutionary approach to strategy, dynamic strategies, including the ideas of dynamic capabilities, and perhaps ultimately complex adaptive systems seen in chaos theory and complexity theory. This latter, however, has provided too much difficulty in terms of nonlinear mathematics and is about as good a forecasting system as weather forecasting. In other words, probably good for 12 hours, but not much more than that. So that's a very brief run through the history of strategy. What is strategy not? This is often quite a useful way of trying to define what it is. Well, firstly, it's far more than a budget. It's determining where the company is going. It needs a budget, but the strategy itself is not a budget. It's not worked out in rigorous detail, and it doesn't develop from the bottom. Indeed, many say it doesn't develop from the top either. It is developed in the senior middle levels of a corporation, sold to the guys above, and then implemented by the guys below. It's not a routine or annual event or a 5-year plan. The length of strategic planning will vary by industry and by company, and of course it changes whenever there is a major change in what's happening in that particular industry. It's certainly not an extrapolation of the past. Forecasting purely on that basis will lead to few insights, nor is it a response to short-term fluctuations. It is known throughout the company if the company is sensible. If it is known only to top management, then it's difficult to see how the management of a company can actually implement that strategy. However, it needs to be flexible and not carved in stone, and is not a set of pious intentions. Strategic management emerges, in my view, from economics. Economics is in many senses a science that bases itself and its determinism on a rather rigid approach to the way in which people behave. Strategy tries to overcome this by trying to observe how people behave and therefore take decisions that are likely to be the ones that would be taken in real life rather than ones which economic man would necessarily take. If we compare the two disciplines, economics concerns itself primarily with the economy, the industry and utility or welfare, whereas strategic management is firmly grounded in the firm itself or the company. It's an attempt to show how the company can become a winner. Economics uses economic theory, mathematics and statistics as its basic core disciplines, whereas strategic management has a much more varied approach, including economic theory, but going through psychology, game theory, sociology, social anthropology, and organizational behavior theory, often in a somewhat superficial way, but it takes note of them in trying to develop its models and its theories.